Welcome to Church of Logic. This is Cody Rue again. I'm still with Camille, and we're going to keep talking about Kurt Gödel's life.
Welcome back. And yes, last time we stopped at that very defining moment in Gödel's life where he published a very powerful result that changed everything in logic. It feels like. So we were trying to figure out what happens next for him after such a powerful result.
Right.
What happens to him?
So, okay. Sorry. So academically, Gödel keeps doing great stuff. He keeps, being a kind of a central figure in mathematical logic. I think Turing's big paper on what's called the Entscheidungsproblem, and that's another thing I'll have to talk about, where he basically defines, what the modern conception of computation was in 1934. So, between 1930 and 1934, just an explosion of results in mathematical logic. Very, very, Germany was the powerhouse in logic at the time, but again, Turing was in England, and so was Russell, and then Church, Alonzo Church, who I named this podcast after, was in the United States, and between the three countries, and France to a lesser extent. The four countries, Austria, Germany, England, and the U.S., a lot of basic, just the big, first 5 chapters of any textbook of mathematical logic were being written. And so very prolific time. Gödel travels to conferences around the world, becomes as famous as he deserved to be, and he meets Einstein, who was already at Princeton, I think, at the time, in 1932. I think. I'm not sure where Einstein was based in 1932, but he certainly met him in the U.S. And they would go on to become very close friends, which is kind of interesting. I mean, Einstein is by far the most famous scientist in the world, and I do think it's significant that he recognized Gödel as being a kindred spirit.
I wonder. I mean, obviously, these two men probably had a lot to talk about, but I wonder if these insane fame that is pretty rare in scientists, I mean, it happens, but at that level, it's pretty rare, if that really brought them together.
Maybe. I'm not sure Gödel was quite as famous as Einstein, at least not at the time. I'm not sure when Einstein went from being, Nobel Prize winner famous to cover of Time magazine famous. I think that was a little later, but this was before general relativity, or was it? No, I'm not sure. This was around the time general relativity was conceived. But yeah, I mean, maybe, yeah. I can't speak to their shared fame as something that connected them. Certainly, their shared interest in the philosophical underpinnings of their work connected them. I think they were both very interested in, theology and the nature of reality, and there was a deep connection there, I think.
It must have been very interesting. I wish I could have been a little mouse just listening to their talk, even though I would probably not have understood anything.
Definitely. There's a lot to say there, and I kind of wanted to save all the anecdotes for a different podcast.
So, okay.
There's so many. But yeah.
So he goes to conferences. He's doing purely research. I mean, knowing the character from my understanding, I can't imagine him teaching, but maybe he did. Did he teach any?
Yeah, he was a lecturer at the University of Vienna.
So he was
Uh,
still in Vienna.
yeah,
Yeah.
he was based in Vienna. He was a lecturer. I think the position is called unpaid lecturer, but I don't actually think it's unpaid. I think it's just like stipend. It's like he doesn't have an official stipend. He was like, kind of like what today would be an assistant professor. Um,
Can
uh,
you imagine being his supervisor? I mean, this guy is so good.
yeah. I mean, University of Vienna. So Hans Hahn was his PhD supervisor, and he was a huge celebrity. It's not like there weren't any bigwigs there.
So he was still able to do very productive and impressive research, um, and he still did. Like, did he do anything that was probably not at the level of the incompleteness theorem, but very highly regarded research?
Yes. He basically so like I said, Hilbert had this list of 23 problems, and he basically solved one of the problems of the first one about like the completeness of logical rules. Um, and um, I think the second or third problem of Hilbert was something called the continuum hypothesis, which is kind of an abstract question about how large infinite sets can be. Um, but Gödel became fascinated by that problem, and it's technically much more difficult. It was more well defined at the time, and it's technically more difficult than the incompleteness theorem. And he proved a big result in that direction. He didn't completely solve the problem, but he sort of solved half of the problem. And so this was a huge deal at the time, and still is today. He basically founded a whole area of research. Um, so this continuum hypothesis stuff was almost kind of a more significant part of his mathematics. It's stuff he worked on for years, decades even. Whereas the incompleteness results, he came up with, a year after his dissertation.
Yeah.
Um, this was actually, yeah, one of the more significant things. But he did a bunch of other stuff. Like I can't get into it during this because I still want to talk about his life. But he did a ton of stuff after this.
So we mentioned that he was still able to produce very interesting work. We talked about his work, but let's move on to his life. So as a young man in early 1930s in Austria, I can't imagine the tension over there. How he, in that very changing world, how did he thrive as a man, as a human, and as a
Yeah,
person?
good question. Um, in 1936, Morris Schlick, who was the leader of the Vienna Circle, is gunned down on the steps of the university by one of his students.
That must have been very traumatic.
Yes, I believe it was. It's hard to know with Gödel because he is very detached, very non-political, very kind of reserved and abstract. He didn't like, talking about politics or getting engaged in this kind of stuff. But I mean, one of his close personal friends and mentors gets gunned down by one of his own students, a Nazi sympathizer, on the steps of the university. I mean, this was a huge deal.
Of course.
And yeah, I mean, this is 1936. In 1938, so very, terrifying year for intellectuals all across Europe, but especially in Germany and in Austria.
Mm-hmm.
So roughly three things happen. One, he gets rejected as a permanent, his contract doesn't get renewed because Austria was annexed by Germany, and they were coming for all the intellectuals, making sure that they were aligned with their politics. And his association with the Vienna Circle, which had a lot of Jewish intellectuals in it, was a mark against him. So basically, he loses his job. Okay, event number one. Event number two, he marries against the express wishes of his parents, a woman called Adele Nimbursky, who was a few years older than him. Not that much older, like 6 years. But at the time, that was like, he was still pretty young. I think his parents just thought she wasn't right for him. And she was a dancer, so I don't know. I find that kind of romantic. He was extremely enamored with her. They had an extremely close relationship. So he gets married. Oh, she was divorced. Yeah, that's
that's
why. That's a pretty big deal.
Here we go. Yes.
And so okay, so the most foundational relationship in his life occurs, right as he loses his job, and he gets conscripted, right? And that's crazy. I mean, that's crazy. It's not crazy, right? They were conscripting people all across Austria, right? The World War II was about to start. But he, and I wish I had more time to talk about this, but I will later. He was deeply paranoid about a lot of things, but one of the things was his health, and he was convinced that he had heart issues. And so mostly he was stressed about it, and anxious. But in this case, he was like, oh, well, my heart issues, I'm never going to get, conscripted into the army because I have obvious heart issues. But that was just his paranoia. So when the doctors examined him, they were like, oh, yeah, you're fine. You can go into the army.
That is crazy to me. So not that he was a severe hypochondriac or, what is absolutely insane to me is that this guy who has produced such amazing work loses his job, even though he is probably in the top 5 of his field, if not top number 1, and then he gets sent to a senseless war. Even though, I mean, it was my understanding that most of the time people who are academics, who are, who teach at university, which obviously he was not anymore, but still, would not be sent to war because we need to...
No. I mean, again, this is the subject of a whole other podcast, but the war effort encompassed everything. Like, all these famous academics were, pulled into the war effort. And it turns out mathematicians were very desirable as, not as soldiers on the front lines, but certainly as engineers that were going to help, develop weapons or develop, strategies or develop, people with mathematical backgrounds were very sought to participate in the war effort.
Okay, yes.
And so this was unacceptable to Gödel. And so,
I mean, he was asked to join and fight a war, and one of the sympathizer of this war, of that side of the war, just killed one of his close friends.
Yes.
This is extremely traumatic, and because I can't. Oh, God.
It is. I've glossed over this, but at this point, Gödel has had essentially a nervous breakdown. It's kind of hard to understand exactly what went wrong with him because, the terminology of psychiatry and psychology has changed so much. But, he's had severe depression. And, who wouldn't, right? The state of the world was just
absolutely
horrendous.
Such traumatic events happened to him in that very short period of time. It is understandable that depression really kicked in at that time.
Yeah.
So, okay, we have this extremely difficult time for him. At the same time, happy, he gets into a relationship that was very important to him, very, very close relationship with his wife. But at the same time, he has to sever probably his ties with his family and his parents. So, how does he move from that? What happens next to him?
Yeah, so what happens next? So he decides that, getting conscripted is unacceptable, which, yeah, thank God. And yeah, he I wrote in my notes, he decides to quote unquote visit Princeton. Basically, he knows that Princeton is going to be happy to accept him as either a long-term guest or an actual lecturer. So yeah, the Institute for Advanced Studies basically was this place where you didn't have to teach, you just did research. And someone with Gödel's influence and fame could just go there and become, and just go there and get a job, basically. And of course, at the time, he was friends with Einstein, who was one of the bigwigs at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. So he decides to just go to Princeton. Except, of course, at the time, you know, the war by then has either started or almost started, and so getting out of the country and fleeing to England or America is quite difficult, and so they decide to go the long way to Princeton, and so they take the Orient Express through Siberia and go the eastern route to Princeton, which seems crazy to me.
Oh, wow.
It's 1938, right? You're going to take ships. There's no planes. And yeah, so you have to go around the world. I mean, it's not, 1838. It's not like you're taking hot air balloons, but come on, like that trip must have been insane.
Yes.
And stressful, right? Like,
and yes, like planning to move to another country is already extremely stressful, but having to kind of hide it and take the long road must have been very difficult. So he gets to Princeton.
Yeah.
Eventually.
He gets
with his wife. I imagine that they travel together.
They travel together. He gets there with his wife, and yeah, he just spends what should have been, I think, the best years of his life, just chatting with Einstein, working on philosophy, working on logic. He actually worked on general relativity. He published some incredible work in general relativity, which seems crazy, right? It's a very different subject than what he was, a specialist in. And one of his students, Paul Cohen, solved the other half of that continuum hypothesis problem I mentioned. So this was, really the golden years, but at the same time, yeah, his paranoia became extremely hard to live with, and so at the same time as he was doing doing cool work in a cool environment, yeah, he was just tortured by this paranoia, and he becomes a U.S. citizen in 1945. There's a famous story around that, and yeah, just keeps working mathematical logic, and sadly, yeah, he died in 1977. Not of old age. He was, he wasn't young, but he was, early 70s.
Yeah, he was 71. And so he stayed at Princeton for the rest of his career. I imagine that he traveled maybe after the war to go to conferences, but
yeah,
his base was mostly Princeton.
I think his paranoia made it hard for him to travel, but he did, I think, a little. And yeah, I mean, towards the end of his life, it became very tough. He had this paranoia of being poisoned, which I don't know. And so he wouldn't eat anyone's cooking other than his wife, including his own. And so when she was hospitalized in 1977, he basically died of hunger. He couldn't eat anymore because he had this fear of eating something that would poison him. And
this is such a tragic end.
It is. And I think, there are a lot of logicians that had this kind of tragic emotional issues that really influence them. And I don't know. The Logic Comics tries to kind of make the point that maybe logic itself is somehow like connected with this, these mental issues. But I don't know. It can't have been, good or easy to live during the war, where like your friends and your family are persecuted, in such a horrendous way, right? I think the World War must have been a much bigger influence on mental health than anything else at the time, right? I mean,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
You start with this baseline paranoia, and then you live through this horrible war with these horrible things, and I don't know.
He had, and again, you haven't gone into any of the anecdotes that are very interesting too, but what a life. What a life. It is, yeah, I'm glad you're doing several episodes on him.
Yeah, we're actually a little long on this one, but I don't think it matters. I think it's fun to like just have this general overview, and then that just sets the tone
Yes.
for all these other details. Like I said, million really entertaining anecdotes about his life, but also, everything he did. He did tons of work in logic, and it's all really, really deep and interesting. And yeah, he had also these kind of interesting philosophical views, which are very non-conventional today. This deep, intertwined between religion and theology and mathematical logic, which I think today is almost, heretical.
It seems difficult to get together, but
reconcile, definitely.
to reconcile. Thank you. Yes, but what an interesting life. Even without considering the amazing results he did. So wow, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Just before we sign off, I'm going to recommend. I think Hao Wang was one of his closest philosophical collaborators. And I think he wrote the most the most influential biography of Gödel, called Reflections on Kurt Gödel, and I would recommend that. I think it's a fascinating read.
Absolutely.
All right.
I'm probably going to read it because I want to know more about Kurt Gödel. Thank you so much.
Thanks.